A true polymath, Professor Fernández-Armesto covers ancient, early modern, medieval, and modern times in his scholarship, engaging with Africa, Asia, Atlantic, Britain, Europe, global, Latin America, Mediterranean, Middle East, United States. He works on empires and colonialism, environment, intellectual, legal, political dimensions, race and ethnicity, religion, science, technology, and medicine, among many others. An excellent example of his amazing scholarship is his book, Out of Our Minds, A History of What We Think and How We Came to Think It, published in 2019 last year. This book examines science, politics, religion, culture, philosophy, and history in order to tell the story of human imagination from the beginning of civilization to the modern day, and even provides insights into cognitive science. Professor Felipe Fernández-Armesto is a recipient of many awards, including the World History Association Book Prize and the Tercentenary Medal of the Society of Antiquaries in 2007. He also received the Grand Cross of the Order of Alfonso X the Wise, Spain's highest honor for contributors to science, scholarship, education, and the arts. His works have been translated into 27 languages. A member of Notre Dame's faculty since 2009, Professor Felipe Fernández-Armesto is a fellow of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. We are very grateful that Felipe is part of our intellectual community, and we are very grateful that he's agreed to giving a virtual lecture for us. Today's lecture is entitled, What, if anything, is Europe? And who is European? The lecture will take about 25 minutes to be followed by Q&A. Please feel free to make use of the Q&A function. We will promptly end at 1:45 to respect people's schedules. Thank you again so much, dear Felipe, for being with us. We are excited. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Clemens. That's very kind. You make me sound like a real sort of maître Jacques. But it's a great, what a great treat it is to be able to take part in this series. I'm very grateful to you and Grant and Melanie and Connor and Tim and Monica, everybody at the Nanovic who's worked so hard to make this lecture series possible. So I feel very privileged, but I'm afraid you may also feel that I'm a bit naughty even to broach the problems that I want to pose today. Because if we can't say who's European or what Europe is, then those of us who belong to the Nanovic Institute and devote ourselves to the study of Europe literally don't know what we're talking about. But if Bob and Elizabeth are watching, or any of my Nanovic Institute colleagues, I beg them, and anyone else who's kind enough to be out there, to bear with me, because you can't truly love any subject, just as you can't truly love anyone, or any country or community, unless you examine them critically and embrace them with all their deficiencies. In a sense, the difficulty I face in today's talk is not that there may be no Europe, but that there are all too many rival and mutually incompatible notions of what, if anything, Europe is or ought to be. A series of historical oscillations has produced many of them, with Europe's alternately huddling together from external threats, or consorting in a sense of collective superiority. In about 500 BC, when I think the term Europe first appeared, rulers of Sparta and Miletus were planning war against Persia with a map of the world in front of them, a distended Europe at the top, overhanging Asia and Africa like a protruding lip dominating the oikumene. That image of superiority endured for a while. I must begin with Europe, wrote Strabo nearly half a millennium later, because it is adapted by nature for excellence in men and governments. In late antiquity, self-knowledge trimmed self-confidence. Medieval world maps crammed a downsized Europe into one corner. In China and Islam, cartographers virtually ignored it. Urban II, in one version of the speech in which he summoned the First Crusade, reduced Europe, and especially the Christian part of it, made the world seem big but graspable. The effect was to re-buoy Europe, re-buoy European self-perceptions on oceans of self-belief. In the 18th century, you could travel from Seville to St. Petersburg with no more sense of dislocation than a modern traveler feels in a succession of airport lounges, across what Gibbon called the fairest part of the world and the most civilized portion of mankind. In the following century, Europe was in the center of the world. It was easy to feel European well-traveled elites and interbred dynasties. And under the shell of global hegemony, European identity incubated. But Humpty Dumpty cracked before hatching in the Europäischen Bürgerkriege of the 20th century. In direct response, began the quest for a new configuration that the European Union represents. We Europeans may not be much good at building unity from within, but the multiplication of post-colonial critics and rival superpowers in the world around us may sharpen our sense of mutual belonging and our awareness of common interests. Brexit may seem a bad omen, but so far, every disaster has strengthened the Union, and I see no reason why Brexit should buck the trend. Increasingly in consequence, Europe is morphing, at least for short, into the name of the European Union. And if, as I hope, the Union continues to become ever closer, I guess that trend will continue, and that for future generations, Europe will come to mean the Union, rather as loosely for many generations past, America meant first and foremost the United States. Like America, Europe was the potential object of a geographical expression long before it became anything resembling a polity. By about 8,500 years ago, the landmass that includes Europe can be said to have emerged from the ice of the last ice age, with roughly the shape and more or less the range of environments that have remained familiar with the odd flux and lurch ever since. That's not to say that Europe makes a convincing continent. Continents, after all, are just terms that imply nothing except the convenience of geographers. Von Lohen mocked the very notion of them by pointing out that the world consists of islands, only some of them are called continents. Europe's anomalous even by that modest standard. Other continents seem to leap from the map because they're divided from each other by water or very narrow land links, whereas Europe, as Paul Valéry said, is just a small promontory of Asia, a peninsular salient that merges indistinguishably at the broad end from the landmass out of which the narrow end sticks. Geographers have never agreed about where to draw a credible dividing line. The Urals are a ridgeless bump. Huge causeways, the northern Eurasian plain and the steppelands to the south, outflank the mountains and make it impossible to say where Europe or European peoples or cultures or biomes yield to Asia. To draw political boundaries are a betrayal of geography in favor of geopolitics. Herodotus despised the Scythians, so he fixed the frontier of his Europe at the Don. Strabo, who saw Scythians as useful buffers for Rome, pushed the boundary out to the Dnieper. The tradition abides of regarding as despicable and dispensable whatever is to the speaker's east. A lot of people, including politicians in positions of responsibility in the European Union, draw their preferred line at the frontiers of Russia and Turkey, in order to keep out huge and doubtfully assimilable communities. On the southern frontier, at least since the 17th century, there have been thinkers or jokers to aver that Africa begins at the Pyrenees. Soviet geographers picked on the ominously named Manic Depression as their choice for the border because they wanted to include Russia, but exclude the Caucasus. At Europe's western extremities, an ocean seems to lap a clear limit. Even here, however, problematic islands complicate the picture, strewn from the Faroes to Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, from Iceland to the Canaries. Europe is obviously, therefore, an anomalous continent, which no geographical reality encompasses of the sort that characterizes other continents, and no such clear structure underpins. Another way of looking at it is as a civilization, or a group of groups with some common features of culture. Civilization is a contested term. We can't coherently speak of a civilization, whatever that is, unless there's a sense in which it's one discrete thing. I don't believe that anyone can point to any feature of European cultures that unites them and collectively distinguishes them from other cultures. If we take the features of life we typically enumerate in profiles of culture or civilizations, if you want to speak of them, religion does more to divide than to unite Europe. Deep trenches dug by the Schism and the Reformation scar the terrain. The prevailing religious traditions are Christian, but say they are in many parts of the world. Indeed, Christianity is an Oriental mystery religion in origin, with its heartlands outside what, even in the broadest sense, we think of as Europe. If we opt to define Europe as a Christian civilization, we're excluding, probably purposefully, non-Christians from a rightful place. Even if you count people who aren't Christian but have inherited elements of Christian tradition, such as, dare I mention, Richard Dawkins, who defines himself as a cultural Christian, apparently on the grounds that he knows but disbelieves the words of Christmas carols. How can you stick with a definition that excludes Jews and Muslims, whose numbers and the depth of whose contributions and the length and stretch of whose presence makes European history unintelligible without them? If there's no such thing as a single European religion, there's nothing consistently and distinctively European in food, or language, or kinship patterns, or arts, or any constituent of culture. We can assert, without Eurocentrism, I think, that there are elements, especially of political culture, and perhaps some mental behaviors and literary and artistic traditions that originated in parts of Europe. But their success in global transmission has placed them within a wider heritage, and they no longer distinguish Europe from other areas of the world, if they ever did. Some people believe in a distinctive European scientific culture based on empiricism, but no group or place owns empiricism. All these cultural assertions are like life buoys, useful to cling to only because they are empty. One can point to common historical experiences that have exerted very broad influence in Europe, but I don't think one can reasonably maintain that they underpin a comprehensive notion of Europe as a single entity of any sort. If anyone wants to nominate any of them, from the Beaker folk to post-colonial ennui, we can discuss it later. But in any case, it's a mistake to suppose that common historical experiences necessarily have unifying effects. They're often fissile and nourish enmities. That's why agglutinative processes such as we've seen in the recent European past, foment fragmentary nationalism and particularism, like the erection of the Napoleonic, Nazi and Soviet empires, or even in benign imitation of such attempts at unification or reunification, the European Union itself. I decline to take seriously former claims that there's a European race or racial basis to European identity in a continent of what H.L. Fisher called energetic mongrels, or perhaps one should say the bastard offspring of a rape by Zeus. Of course, we can fall back on arbitrary working definitions. In an institute like ours, I don't think it would be improper to say that Europe's whatever avowed Europeanists want to study. I recall once visiting a Pacific Studies Center in a distinguished university where the area covered included Brazil. I've seen an Indian Ocean project that covered New South Wales. When I edited the Times Guide to the Peoples of Europe, I had to take an arbitrary executive decision. We'd count anyone who or whose ancestors had asserted European identity, even if such claims could not be justified by any objective definition. And we included all communities that inhabited states where such people lived. In consequence, all subject peoples of the Soviet Union and Turkey got a look in, including some whom no Europeanist had ever studied, as far as I know. Whether Chukchi or Kurds, for instance, are European in any sense that also applies, say, to Alsatians or Swiss, seems doubtful. But what about marginal cases, such as Mordvins, Veps, Nenets, and Chechens? Does anyone feel confident at drawing a line among them? Still, nothing in the world, nothing in the sublunary world anyway, is both real and perfect. So far, I guess I've spoken of Europe as if it were definable, if at all, by what's outside it. But I think we can see the reality and the imperfection of Europe better, perhaps, if we look at it from within. And this is where I'd like to bring in my map, if we could show that. Oh, well, thank you very much, Colin. That's excellent. The map before us is of Europe as I like to represent it. Simplified, yes, as you'd expect from a teacher, but not, I claim, oversimplified. Schematic, yes, of course, as pedagogy demands, but not, I aver, excessively so. This version of my personal image of Europe comes from my book on global exploration and is intended to illustrate the historic formation of a single unit of commercial and cultural exchange, embracing the parts of the world that we usually include in our pictures of Europe. You'll see that if we abstract its main lines as a time-pressed portraitist or caricaturist might, Europe resembles a kind of acute angle with Gibraltar at its apex and arms formed respectively by the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. The latter extending as far as the Baltic cul-de-sac, the former as far as the Black Sea. Roughly bisecting the angle, a breakwater extends almost uninterruptedly across the middle of the length of Europe. Upland chains from the Spanish Meseta and Cantabrians via the Pyrenees, the Massif Central, Alps and Carpathians, to the great boglands centered on the Pripyat marshes. From this breakwater, rivers carry commerce in opposite directions, northward or southward, towards the great seas. The big exception is the Rhone, which explains its huge economic importance in antiquity. Except via the Rhone and the Toulouse Gap, it's hard to cross that breakwater. Think of the Iceman, not Eugene O'Neill's, but his real-life homonym, whom the world's oldest naturally mummified human body once enclosed. He died in the ice while trying to cross the Ötztal Alps in the 4th millennium BC, with a wound in his shoulder, berries in his basket, venison in his stomach, and a bow and a copper-headed axe slung over his back. Neither axis of this European angle was easy to construct. If it's hard to get overland from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic zone, it's not easy by sea either. The map shows the critical spatial relationships. The Atlantic side communities from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic were in touch with each other by way of emporium trading from at least the 2nd millennium BC, perhaps earlier. From early in the following millennium, direct sea-wide voyages linked the Mediterranean. But the Atlantic shore covers a huge climatic range which deterred navigation along its entire length. The mid-Mediterranean narrows divided the southerly sea. Scylla and Charybdis menaced shipping. The frog pond of Socrates, I suppose, may not have encompassed the whole sea. He was thinking rather perhaps of the Aegean, or at most of the Aegean and Ionian seas combined. Even St. Paul never, as far as we know, fulfilled his ambition of seeing Spain, and only got to Malta when borne there by a shipwreck. Even once you've defied the sirens, you're still only halfway across the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. There's a fierce current that stoppers the Strait of Gibraltar like a cork in a bottle. Even when ancient navigators broke into the ocean, tidal conditions along lee shores exposed to ferocious winds were unfamiliar to sailors and unsuitable for carvel-built hulls. In consequence, most of the economic history of Europe has comprised two stories: the making of a Mediterranean economy and of an Atlantic equivalent. Both are old stories, millennia old, recounted with great brilliance by Cyril Broodbank for the Mediterranean and Barry Cunliffe for the oceanic face of the European littoral. The integration of the Mediterranean and Atlantic zones was a long job, unachieved until the Roman Empire supplemented the sea voyage with enhanced overland routes along which armies marched. But the fall of Rome imperiled integration. And ever since, the history of Europe could have been written in terms of the quest to reunite the sundered moieties. The European Union is the latest and best equipped attempt. In my map, as you can see, the angle formed by the Atlantic and Mediterranean faces of Europe subtends an imperfect triangle, of which the Volga Valley forms the third side. The Volga is, in a sense, as I see it, Europe's third sea, the causeway of Stenka-Razin and the Volga boatman, the mighty bosom where the wind blows wild and free. It's exceptionally navigable for such a long river over almost all its length. It drains a vast area, formerly rich in furs, the black gold of Russian history, and crosses many of the fertile patches of soil that speckle the steppes. Like the Mediterranean and Atlantic zones, it acquired a measure of economic unity in antiquity when the amber and furs of the north met gold and oriental trade goods from the Caspian. Rus and Muslim traders met along the river in the Middle Ages. The expansion of Muscovy at Kazan's expense in the 16th century unified the river politically. Europe, except in imaginations, never quite reached, at least not enduringly, the shore of its third sea. And according to the representation in my map, the understanding my map represents, Europe remains complete until it does. Similarly, there's no reason in principle, albeit of course plenty of practical obstacles, why Europe's boundaries shouldn't be elastic enough to stretch across the Mediterranean. The lands there on the southern coast, formerly coveted and sometimes conquered from the northern shore, formed part of the Roman Empire and of late antique Christendom. They inherited in different proportions thinking and learning of Greek and Jewish origins, just as on the northern shore, or even with more intensity and endurance. So for those who do think of Europe as a product of common experience, would people there on the southern shore be any less well qualified to think of themselves as European, if they so wished, than the English or the Faroese? We can dispense with the map now, because I want to express, I suppose, the temptation, at least, to conclude that Europe doesn't exist, except perhaps as a misnomer. But I think we should rather see it as an œuvre inachevée, a project underway, with no prospects of completion if the current obstacles to the integration of Russia, Turkey, and lands on the southern and Levantine shores of the Mediterranean remain in place. People who live beyond the present or recent extremities of the Union may have to remain as outsiders and aliens, with reference to whom soi-disant Europeans can spot their own identity more easily than by looking inwards, where they see chiefly their mutual differences. Europe will continue to be neither more nor less than the object of the muddled, conflicted minds of those who identify with it, or the schematic maps of those of us who try to make sense of it from the perspective of Notre Dame or other far-flung perches. The Union may succumb to the fissile processes that every agglutinative process prompts, or fragmentation may be confined to existing states and regions while the Union as a whole gets stronger. Whatever happens, the job of students of Europe in an institute such as ours is not to tell the story of a region already defined, but to try to track a still unfolding concept and a reality that is at best, even after millennia of effort, still inchoate.
Felipe, thank you so much.
Well, very kind of you to still be listening. Thank you, Clarence.
Thank you so much. I started counting the words I do not understand, but at some point I gave up because as a non-native speaker, it's amazing, your word treasure. Just the many words that you know, and the clear message that you give us that there is no clarity about Europe. So the floor is open for questions. Just use the Q&A function, please. Maybe I can start us off with a question. Felipe, if you compare European studies with Asian studies or Latin American studies, is the problem about definition of scope the same, or are there differences when you look at these three different fields?
I think that the answer is that they're both the same and yet also different. It's a typical academic answer, but as my old tutor Carl Leiser used to say, we must wallow in the beguiling contradictions of the evidence. So let's take Latin America first, because I mean, obviously I'm also supposed to be a Latin Americanist. And you know, I mean, Latin America, it's such an elusive notion. It really makes no sense even to talk about Latin America. I think if we were pernickety about our terminology, we'd just eliminate the term from our lexicon, because as a geographical nation, it kind of makes no sense. I mean, you know, what about places like Easter Island or the Malvinas? You know, how much of the Caribbean is in Latin America? Does Latin America stop at the Rio Grande, or you know, does it include other communities, all that. As a cultural concept, it's also very bizarre because, you know, what does it mean to be Latin? Does it mean having Romance language? Well, does that in that case you'd have to exclude Belize and Suriname, and you'd have to include Quebec, you know. So really, I mean, I'm and the whole word, the very word Latin is, you know, I think mistranslation from, you know, the term which within Europe had a certain meaning, but really when transferred to the Americas, ceased to be applicable in any really coherent way. So to be a Latin Americanist is, in a sense, I suppose, to try to make sense of that mess. And there are, you know, Latin Americanists who I think are interested in trying to find commonalities which can justify the unit of study that they see themselves as working on. Of course, it's going to be a very different unit of study from one Latin Americanist to another. In the case of Asia, I think the difficulties are slightly different because no one who calls himself or herself a nationalist claims to have a coherent notion of what it is to be Asian. It's just a term of convenience. And I don't think anybody who's a nationalist studies more than a part of Asia and even aspires to encompass the whole of it. And if they did, they'd be on a hiding to nothing because there isn't anything that justifies treating Asia as a unit of study. And of course, in the academic world, you know, we've developed these national demarcation lines really as a result of an historic accident of the way universities were founded and developed. And, you know, I mean, if I had my way, if I could, you know, start a university from scratch, I mean, God forbid that I should ever have the hubris to do anything so stupid. I mean, I just wouldn't organize it this way at all. You know, I wouldn't have departments, I wouldn't have area studies and so on. But the fact that we've got them isn't necessarily a disadvantage, provided, you know, we embrace their limitations and cultivate the sort of, you know, cross-departmental links that the Nanovic Institute exists to nourish.
Indeed. Thank you, Felipe. We have 4 questions already fed into the Q&A. One question from Daniel. In contemporary Europe, who do you view as the leader, whether it's a person or a nation?
Well, thank God. Europe, I mean, it depends whether you mean Europe or the European Union. Even the European Union, in which you might think it makes sense to talk about a leader because the European Union is an institution. And typically we think of Clements as our leader in the Nanovic Institute. I'm sure he'd hurry to repudiate any such suggestion. Of course, institutions are not always like that, you know, because the European Union is an institution of such Byzantine complexity that, thank God, nobody runs it. You know, I mean, it really consists of a lot of competing centers of authority who between them work out a kind of balance, not the same balance as in the US Constitution, which is supposed to be balance between the legislature, the executive, and the judicature, which really seems to be run by the plutocracy. It's a different balance, but it works out as a kind of balance because each institution checks the other. So the president of the European Commission is not the leader of Europe. Maybe, you know, there's a sort of analogy with the Swiss constitution where you wouldn't say that the president of Switzerland is the leader of Switzerland. Indeed, nobody in Switzerland ever knows who it is because they change with such frequency. And of course, Switzerland has a cantonal system which is not quite like the European system of you know, quasi sub-federal nation states, but which also has a similar inhibiting effect on any notion of leadership. I know some great Swiss jokes, but we don't have time to tell them at the
Yes,
moment.
meanwhile, we have 5 other questions.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, we've got to get on with that. I'm so sorry.
Yes, we have to move on. From an anonymous attendee, what pressures do minority and provincial European communities face to obliterate their distinctiveness to conform to the Greenwich meridian of majoritarian European cultures?
Oh, I see. Well, I feel that is a rather colored question. It's a bit on the lines of, when did you stop beating your wife? I mean, I just don't think that there is such kind of authoritarian framework. And on the contrary, I mean, I think most European states, I grant you that there are some exceptions and also differences of degree between European states, but most European states are broadly configured to nourish and encourage their historic communities to identify themselves within the compass of the state to which they belong and the union to which all of those states in turn belong. So, the classic case, the case that everybody thinks of is Belgium, where you've got a federal system with it's like a dumbbell, these two rather sort of ill-assorted communities somehow, sticking together. Or Spain, which is a particular country, as Richard Ford called it, that unamalgamating bundle, where we've got all these different historic communities, including the one to which I belong, which is Galicia. My uncle wanted to be buried in a Galician flag, and that's a family with a long-standing, Galicianist tradition. One of my uncles wrote a Galician Spanish dictionary. My father's first book was written in Galician. So we have all these different communities, all of whom see their status within Spain as different, and it's very difficult to juggle them. But no one wants to repress them or stop them expressing their identity or fulfilling what they may come to see as their destinies. And of course, in Spain, we have a particular problem at the moment with Catalonia, where people are pretty evenly divided between wanting to continue to collaborate in the Spanish state with other communities or secede from it. And in the fullness of time, that those tensions will have to be worked out democratically. And you can say similar things about Germany, which has this Länder system, and even the Bavarians, some Bavarians think they'd be better off, and because Italy is a similar sort of mess, and even countries like Sweden have their minorities. They've got the Islanders, and of course Finland has Swedish speakers and so on. Norway has Bokmal and even and London. So even countries that we think of as very culturally homogenous have these tensions. So I think that's a very long way of answering that question, which I could equally perhaps have answered by just saying no.
All right. No. Another question about integration. What is the nature of the problems with the integration of Russia, Turkey, and why does it have significance in Europe's future?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, very obviously has significance in Europe's future, because a European Union, again, depends what one means by Europe. If one means the future of the concept of Europe, obviously it's very important, because a concept of Europe which embraces Russia and Turkey is clearly much more open-ended and open-minded than one which doesn't. And paradoxically, I think the more different cultures you embrace in your concept of Europe, if you have one, in a strange paradoxical way, the more coherent it becomes, because the less each particular anomaly matters. So in my concept, I mean, I include Russia and Turkey in my concept of Europe without any difficulty. Okay. But if it comes to the European Union, I mean, that's a very much harder problem. Not, I think, primarily because Turks are Muslims on the whole. I think it's easy and proper if you're a pluralist to see Europe as including a great diversity of cultures and religions, and Muslims in particular, because there are already a lot of Muslims in the European Union, and a lot of Europe, including parts of Spain and the Balkans, have and even you could say Sicily and parts of southern Italy have possibly even could even say there's a big Muslim contribution to the history of France. Because of all these historic and contemporary realities, you can't say we can't have the Turks because they're Muslims. On the other hand, both of these communities, Russians and Turks, are huge, demographically, and to include them in the European Union would be problematic from an institutional point of view, because if they continue to see themselves as having common interests distinct from those of other Europeans, that's going to be a problem for a European democracy in which one man and woman has one vote. So that's really the reason why it's difficult to see Russia and Turkey being welcomed into the European Union in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Felipe. May I follow up with another integration question that we got? You mentioned that the fall of Rome imperiled integration. Do you believe, aside from the European Union, that there will ever be such a structure of similar integration in Europe's future?
Oh, well, thank you very much for the question. I used integration at that point in the talk specifically to mean economic, commercial integration of the Atlantic and Mediterranean zones. And I think we've got that. I think we are reasonably well integrated. And I think there are certain kinds of Norwegian cheese that don't have a very large sale in the Mediterranean market. But I think, broadly speaking, we have got a sort of integrated European commercial. So it's going to be very interesting to see how negotiations between Britain and the rest of the European, or former rest of the European Union, unfold in preserving that commercial unity, that common market. And it really does, that common market really does extend right along the Atlantic and Mediterranean shores of Europe, because it reaches the Black Sea and the Baltic. So we've got back to the sort of ancient unified European economy. I wasn't speaking about integration in any sort of political or cultural sense, and I think that's obviously very much more problematic. And I don't even know whether, I'm not. Quite honestly, I wouldn't even want that. I think pluralism is the only future that we can embrace, not only in Europe but also in America. In any part of the modern democratic world, if we don't embrace pluralism, we have no peaceful or prosperous future to look forward to, because ironically, pluralism is the one thing that unites us.
That's a great statement, thank you. I do believe polymaths like you have an easier time to deal with pluralism than mediocre people like us, but that's a side note.
Well, it's very kind of you to put it like that.
We have another question.
Polymath is just a euphemism, either for a know-all or for a sciolist.
Felipe, we have another question at the intersection of politics and epistemology. And the question is, what are the driving forces behind trying to fit Europe into different boxes or categories? And who are the main culprits? Is it Europeans, outsiders, or both?
Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure that I'd want to use the term driving force behind. Because I think, in a way, the terms of the question occlude what, if I can presume to say so, I suspect the questioner really has in mind, which is who, what are we talking about? Who are the people who want to do this kind of stuff? And obviously, I think academics do have to take some of the blame, because one of the curses of academic study, maybe that's what's driven me to be what Clements kindly calls a polymath, is that trying to establish a coherent unit of study is extremely difficult. I mean, it's very difficult in the humanities. Actually, also really very difficult in the sciences, because nothing makes sense except in context. And the context doesn't make sense except in a further context. You keep adding context. Nonetheless, you're still looking for a coherent unit of study. And then obviously, politicians are very responsible for this, and the propagandists whom they patronize and employ. And I mentioned rather wryly the definitions of Europe that we find in Herodotus and Strabo, which are clearly very self-interested and aligned with political objectives. And we've gone on having similar contributions from other thinkers ever since, and we're still getting them today. So, I mean, I think it's those are the two main sort of culprit bodies, the academics and the politicians.
Thank you, Felipe. We got a question from another Nanovic fellow, our colleague, Professor Maurizio Albahari. He wants to thank you for an amazing lecture. And then the question is there room for a non-Eurocentric and yet global role/value for the ever-unfolding project that is Europe?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, obviously, this is a very important question. It depends, obviously, what one means. Kind of another academic way of answering a question. It depends what you mean by Eurocentrism. By Eurocentrism, I mean a way of looking at the world which so headlines, which so privileges Europe as to occlude the importance of other parts of the world. And so as long as one's careful not to do that, I think Eurocentrism can be very easily avoided in almost any project. As far as the ever closer union that the European Union aspires to be is concerned, obviously this is bound to evoke accusations from political or post-colonial accusations of being an attempt to restore European global hegemony. I mean, I very much remember, I know I've got time to tell this anecdote, but when I was very, very young, one of my ways of supplementing my income was as a speechwriter. And I worked for a speechwriting agency. And on one occasion, I had to write a speech for, I think it was the Liberian foreign minister, something like that at the time, which was all about the European Union. It was this terrible denunciation, these former imperialists struggling to retrieve their lost global status. So one's always going to, I think, face those accusations. But I think if one confronts them honestly and says that a more united Europe is going to be good for the world, and as long as one ensures that the relative prosperity of Europe doesn't grow at the expense of other people, especially of the world's poor, but attunes economic policy to ensure that that doesn't happen, I think it would be possible not only to rebut those accusations, but to resist them in reality.
Thank you, Felipe. We go back to the integration question. Since Professor Fernández-Armesto mentioned that Europe will increasingly become equivalent to the EU, what does it say about the European identity of Britain after Brexit?
Well, I think thank you very much for the question. I think if I'm right, and people start, talking about Europe, meaning the European, well, people already use the term Europe just to mean the European Union. And I liken this to using the term America to mean the United States. So if that does continue to happen, then obviously when people speak of Europe in that sense, they won't be speaking any longer of Britain. But I mean, I don't know, I feel very sheepish about this question because to me, I'm kind of Anglo-Spanish. I mean, I always call myself a Spanish. Well, I used to, when the British did something I didn't like, I called myself a Spaniard. And when the Spanish did something I didn't like, I called myself British. Now I don't like anything that I don't do. I don't know what to call myself anymore. But you know, so by ancestry, by birth, I'm Anglo-Spanish. And the Spanish part of me just doesn't understand secession from the European Union, because I remember when I was a little boy going to the Dos de Mayo celebrations in Madrid, and it was terrible because people used to say, oh, you know, we beat those French, you know, and if they never dare to come back, we will beat them again. And then when Spain joined the European Union, of course, everything changed. The European flag was flying. The speeches were all about how marvelous those French are and how we're all going to collaborate in future. And I thought to myself, you know, how wonderful that we're in this new world. But of course, from a British perspective, it's not so easy, I don't think, to see the European Union in that sort of positive way, because the British haven't experienced the same degree of internecine bloodshed, you know, that most other countries within the European Union have in the 20th century. They don't feel that they need to escape from that background. So there are, in other words, you know, there is a big difference between Britain and most of the rest of the Union. But I still couldn't make sense of British secession. I mean, it just seems so mad. It's just so economically, it makes no sense. In terms of global geopolitics, it really makes no sense. I mean, some of the supporters of Brexit think they can sort of drift off into the Atlantic and have a new relationship with the United States. I don't see that as you know, an option in any way equivalent to remaining within the European Union in terms of either the economic or the political benefits to the peoples of the United Kingdom. So I'm inclined to think the situation won't last all that long. I mean, it's got to last long enough to save the face of the Brexiteers.
Yeah.
But, you know, at some point, people will come to their senses. And of course, then Britain will have to rejoin the European Union on less favorable terms than she enjoyed when she left it. And I'm pretty sure that day has got to come.
Wow, that's a strong statement. Maybe a last question. We have debated that at the Nanovic Institute. What's the status, in your opinion, of the Enlightenment as something like a candidate to talk about European uniqueness?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I mean, obviously, I uttered in the course of the lecture, I uttered this phrase which I'm quite proud of. It's rather shameful to be proud of one's phrase making, but I remember I said that in the 18th century it was possible to travel from Seville to St. Petersburg with no more sense of dislocation than a modern traveller feels in a succession of airport lounges. And, you know, and it is true, therefore, that in what we call the Enlightenment, I mean, it was Kant who I think who thought of that word, Aufklärung. What we think of as the period of the Enlightenment was a period when people's sense of belonging to Europe, at least people at a high level of society and education, really did think that they belonged to this republic of letters, which encompassed all these different parts of that corner of the world. So in a way, you could say that the notion of Europe is part of the heritage of the Enlightenment, and we lost it when in Europe we lost much of the heritage of the Enlightenment, doused in the blood of the French Revolution. Yeah. And, you know, ironically, in some ways, the Enlightenment survived better in the United States in the 19th century than it did in Europe. But I think that for the purposes of forging a European future, or future for the European Union, I think these Enlightenment notions of a coherent Europe are no more than a fond memory. They're not. I can't see them having any force in resurrecting a more united Europe. Unfortunately, nowadays, indeed, if you say to people, well, you know, this is part of the heritage of the Enlightenment, they immediately accuse you of being politically incorrect and say we don't want the heritage of that ghastly Enlightenment here anymore. Thank you very much. So I think it's pretty, we can forget it really pretty much as not forget it as an historical fact, but forget it as a way of promoting European unity.
Thank you so much. We have reached our final minute. I really want to take this plea for pluralism and a good culture of pluralism away from this fantastic lecture. Professor Felipe Fernández-Armesto, thank you so much for this great lecture, where we got many compliments already. Thanks to you. We had a wonderful hour. Thank you also to Jenny, Mel, Connor, and Grant, and Tim, who helped with the technological background work. Thank you to our audience and the participants and your questions and discussion. And finally, an announcement, our second virtual lecture will happen on September 22nd. Timothy Rybeck will talk about statue toppling in Europe. So it's a political theme again. We are at time 1:45. Thank you again so much, Felipe, and all of you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your lives. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
It's a wonderful opportunity. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.